Joe Bandel's 2026 book, The Oak Matrix Unleashed, demands we weaponize chaos theory to obliterate cultural shame and achieve a state of unashamed, sacred empowerment in the present moment. Chapter 7 of this work, titled Should We Be Ashamed of Ourselves?, presents a framework where the very flaws, desires, and survival instincts society conditions us to hide become the exact fuel needed to trigger a quantum leap in personal evolution. The text frames self-acceptance not as passive resignation, but as a dynamic transmutation of imperfection into strength, utilizing the duality of what he identifies as male and female energetic paths. Eloise, Bandel takes the mathematical principles of chaos and maps them directly onto human neurosis, arguing that shame functions as an artificial constraint on our natural vitality.
The central thesis hinges on the idea that shame acts as a dam, restricting the natural flow of human energy. When we suppress our physical sensuality or our inherent energetic differences to comply with cultural demands for conformity, we build immense psychological stress. Bandel argues this mimics a nonlinear, chaotic system in physics reaching a critical threshold. Instead of trying to release that pressure slowly or retreating into repression, he suggests embracing the chaos fully in the present moment. The system, our psyche, then leaps to a new level of stability, transforming what was perceived as a shameful flaw into a perfected state of resilience. He grounds this heavily in his broader philosophy of organic Gnosticism, which rejects the traditional ascetic idea that the spiritual must be divorced from the raw physical reality of our bodies.
That integration of the physical and spiritual seems to be a recurring theme in his work, especially when tracing the evolution from his 2010 book, Modern Survivalism, to this 2026 rewrite. It is worth noting the philosophical lineage here. Bandel translated Max Stirner's 1907 anarchist text, The Ego and His Own, back in 2014. Stirner's radical individualism, the rejection of societal dogmas in favor of the self, clearly permeates Bandel's concept of the sacred self. But applying mathematical chaos theory to emotional states requires a massive conceptual bridge. Chaos theory, originally developed to understand erratic behavior in weather patterns or fluid dynamics, deals with deterministic systems that are highly sensitive to initial conditions. How does Bandel justify translating the butterfly effect into a mechanism for overcoming personal shame?
Psychological applications of chaos theory have gained traction over the last decade, often utilized to explain how human emotions can fall into unpredictable yet bounded patterns, known as strange attractors. Researchers studying emotion dysregulation have found that a person's psychological state operates much like a complex system, balancing on the edge of chaos and order. Bandel seizes on this concept. He posits that cultural shame forces the psyche into a state of unnatural rigidity. The fear of being flawed or making mistakes creates a stagnant order. When a person acknowledges a flaw, say a bold passion or a past regret, they introduce a small perturbation into that rigid system. According to the butterfly effect, this tiny shift in the initial conditions of the psyche causes the stagnant order to break down chaotically. If the individual holds that tension and fully accepts the flaw without retreating into shame, the system undergoes a spontaneous reorganization. It leaps into a higher state of coherence. Bandel calls this flaw transmutation, where the chaotic stress of imperfection resolves into the stability of self-acceptance.
That mechanism suggests that psychological suffering is a necessary prerequisite for evolution, rather than a symptom to be medicated away. But Bandel introduces a layer of complexity by interweaving this chaos model with a rigid framework of duality. He specifically categorizes energetic differences into male and female soul paths. The text describes the male path as expansive, philosophical, and outward-facing, while the female path is containing, emotional, and inward-facing. In contemporary psychology and sociology, assigning specific psychological or spiritual traits to a binary gender model is often criticized as biological essentialism. It risks reinforcing the exact cultural constraints he claims to be dismantling.
The framework certainly borders on essentialism, if taken literally as a prescription for biological men and women. Bandel attempts to mitigate this by framing the male and female paths as universal energetic principles, rather than strict biological mandates. He characterizes this dynamic as duality's loving embrace. In his view, Western culture's demand for sameness is what causes suffering, because it ignores the natural tension between opposing forces. He maps the expansive outward energy, the willingness to take bold risks and make visible mistakes, as the male component of the equation. The female component acts as the containing, transformative space where those inward lessons are integrated into wisdom. Growth, according to the Oak Matrix, only happens when these two forces unite. The chaos of the outward expansion is stabilized by the inward acceptance. While the terminology relies heavily on traditional gender binaries, the underlying philosophical mechanism is about reconciling action with reflection. He argues that honoring these distinct energetic differences is an act of sacred rebellion against a culture that prefers predictable, homogenized individuals.
If the goal is to rebel against a homogenized culture, we must examine how Bandel instructs his readers to perform this rebellion daily. The text outlines specific, nature-based rituals to force this psychological leap. One prominent example is the oak tree meditation. The practitioner is instructed to physically touch the gnarled bark of an oak tree, visualizing the twisted roots as their own imperfections and the soaring branches as the resulting perfection. This tactile engagement with nature seems designed to ground the abstract chaos theory in the physical body. He explicitly rejects what he terms beastly views of physicality, demanding that sensuality and bodily vitality be treated as divine.
The emphasis on the physical body is arguably the most radical aspect of his approach to overcoming shame. Many esoteric or self-empowerment philosophies advocate transcending the body to reach a higher spiritual plane. Bandel insists that the body is the sacred ground of the present moment. He uses the concept of bioelectrical energy, suggesting that physical vitality generated through passion, dance, or creation is the highest expression of divinity. Cultural programming, particularly anti-sexual or puritanical norms, dams this bioelectrical flow. The sacred body ritual he proposes involves affirmative physical touch and vibrant movement to deliberately rupture that dam. By acting out the vitality that society deems inappropriate or excessive, the individual forces the system into chaos. The resulting leap to joy and confidence is the manifestation of the strange attractor finding a new, healthier equilibrium. The oak tree serves as the ultimate metaphor for this process. It does not hide its scars or deformities. It integrates them into its structural integrity.
The metaphor of the oak tree integrating its scars translates directly into his perspective on trauma and survival. Bandel frames survival not as a mere scraping by, but as a state of divine joy. He describes survivors as unrestricted gods and goddesses who overcome societal limitations. However, his assertion that everyone has the same present moment with unlimited possibilities introduces a controversial stance on privilege and systemic restriction. He explicitly states there should be no pity for those choosing stagnation, equating the choice to remain in shame with choosing spiritual death. This philosophy of living for the strong borders on a social Darwinist mindset, dismissing the very real material conditions that might prevent someone from actualizing this boundless bioelectrical joy.
That is the sharpest edge of his philosophy. The mandate to reject pity can easily be interpreted as a lack of compassion for systemic suffering. Bandel attempts to soften this by defining the strong not as those who dominate others, but as those who take radical self-responsibility for their internal state in the present moment. His argument is that dwelling on victimhood or relying on the pity of others reinforces the stagnant order of shame. By demanding that every individual recognize their equal opportunity to choose their reaction in the now, he's trying to short-circuit the psychological trap of learned helplessness. In the context of his survival celebration ritual, overcoming a setback like a job loss is not about ignoring the hardship, but about extracting the vital lessons and celebrating the resilience gained. He views societal restrictions as necessary friction, the obstacles required to generate the chaos that leads to evolution.
If someone remains stagnant, he argues it is because they are terrified of the chaotic leap required to break their chains.
By reframing systemic obstacles as mere friction for personal evolution, Bandel places the entire burden of liberation on the individual psyche. This aligns with the historical trajectory of Stirner's egoism, where external authorities are viewed as phantoms, and only the self holds true power. The practical applications outlined in the chapter require a relentless internal vigilance. The opportunity sink, for instance, demands a daily morning affirmation of 3 possibilities, followed by evening reflection and the deliberate release of any accumulated shame. This requires maintaining a perpetual state of heightened awareness, constantly transmuting daily frictions before they can crystallize into a stagnant, shameful order.
Maintaining that state of heightened awareness is exactly what he means by generating energy shamelessly. It requires treating the mundane aspects of life as spiritual exercises. The partnership practices he describes, where individuals share expansive ideas while receiving containing wisdom, highlight his belief that we cannot achieve this state in total isolation. Even though the burden of liberation rests on the individual, the process is catalyzed by interaction.
The tension between two people communicating, the clash of different energetic paths, creates the necessary chaotic perturbations. When two people engage without shame, they act as mirrors, exposing each other's hidden flaws and forcing the transmutation process. It is a demanding, exhausting way to live, but it offers a complete alternative to the numbing conformity of modern culture. The ultimate goal of the Oak Matrix Unleashed is to construct a life where every flaw, every failure, and every physical desire is immediately integrated into a stronger, more resilient architecture of the self.
Bandel's synthesis of nonlinear dynamics, esoteric duality, and radical physical acceptance presents a demanding challenge to modern psychological norms. He asks readers to look at the twisted, gnarled roots of their own histories and see them not as deformities to be hidden, but as the foundational strength required to support a vast, expansive canopy. If you found this exploration of chaos, shame, and the sacred self compelling, please share this episode with someone who appreciates diving into the deep end of philosophy.